August 1944. Camp Hearne, Texas. The train doors slide open. Heat floods in like a furnace blast. Dust hangs in the air, thick and golden under the brutal sun. A line of German soldiers steps onto American soil for the first time, not as conquerors, but as prisoners. Their uniforms are faded, stained with salt and sweat from weeks at sea. They expect brutality. They expect chains. They've been told stories about American savagery, about starvation camps and executions in the desert. Instead, a young GI hands one of them a cold glass bottle. Condensation beads down the sides. The label reads Coca-Cola. The German stares at it, confused, suspicious. He doesn't drink, not yet, because in his mind, this has to be a trick. By the summer of 1943, the war had turned. The Wehrmacht was no longer advancing, it was retreating. North Africa had fallen. Sicily was next. And across the Atlantic, America was preparing to hold something unprecedented, hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers on its own soil. Between 1943 and 1945, more than 370,000 German prisoners of war were shipped to the United States. They came in waves, captured in Tunisia, in Italy, later in France and Germany itself. They arrived expecting the worst. Nazi propaganda had painted America as a nation of gangsters and weaklings, a country rotting from the inside, barely able to feed its own people. The prisoners had been told that capture by the Americans meant torture, slave labor, perhaps death. But the United States had a different plan. Under the terms of the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war were entitled to humane treatment, food, shelter, medical care, the right to work for wages, and crucially, protection from violence and exploitation. President Franklin Roosevelt made it clear, America would not stoop to the methods of its enemies. The camps would be run correctly, lawfully, and visibly. This was as much a propaganda weapon as it was a moral stance. The logistics were staggering. Europe was a war zone. British camps were overflowing. The Soviet Union had its own brutal plans for captured Germans. So, America became the solution. German POWs were loaded onto transport ships and sent across the Atlantic, far from the fighting, far from the possibility of escape or rescue. They traveled in cramped holds, sick and exhausted, many still wearing the uniforms they'd been captured in weeks or months earlier. When they arrived at American ports, New York, Norfolk, New Orleans, they were processed, interrogated, and classified. The U.S. Army separated hardcore Nazis from regular Wehrmacht soldiers. SS officers were isolated. Those suspected of war crimes were flagged. The rest were divided by rank and shipped inland to camps scattered across the country: Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, Georgia, Michigan, even as far as Montana and California. The camps themselves were hastily constructed but functional, rows of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. They weren't death camps. They weren't gulags. They were closer to military bases, albeit ones where the occupants had no weapons and nowhere to go. Each camp held between 500 and 5,000 men. Some were built near small rural towns where labor was desperately needed. Others were isolated in desert or farmland, far from civilian eyes. Most German soldiers had never been to America. Their knowledge of the country came from Nazi propaganda films and speeches. They'd been told that America was a Jewish-controlled plutocracy, morally degenerate, militarily incompetent. They believed that American soldiers were poorly trained and cowardly. They believed that the American homeland was starving, rationing every scrap of food while its leaders lived in luxury. Then they stepped off the trains, and nothing matched the story. The first shock was the food. Within hours of arrival, prisoners were fed meals that exceeded anything they'd eaten in months, sometimes years. White bread, fresh meat, vegetables, coffee with real sugar. Portions were generous, almost absurd by European standards. The Geneva Convention mandated that POWs receive the same rations as the soldiers guarding them, and in America, that meant plenty. For men who had survived the collapse of the Africa Corps, who had watched their rations shrink as supply lines crumbled, this was incomprehensible. Some refused to eat at first, convinced the food was poisoned or part of some psychological experiment. Others devoured everything in sight and asked for more. There was more. Then came the luxuries: ice cream, Coca-Cola, chocolate bars, things that had vanished from Germany years earlier, if they'd ever been common at all. American guards handed out cigarettes freely. Prisoners were given clean uniforms, access to showers, medical care for wounds and illnesses that had gone untreated for months. Dentists pulled rotten teeth. Doctors treated infections. The contrast with their expectations was so extreme that many prisoners assumed they were being fattened up for something sinister. But nothing sinister came. Instead, life in the camps settled into routine. Prisoners were assigned work details, road construction, forestry, agricultural labor on nearby farms. The work was hard, but not brutal. They were paid a small wage in camp scrip, which could be spent at canteens, stocked with goods that seemed impossible. Soap, razors, writing paper, candy, beer. Some camps even had theaters where prisoners performed plays, or sports fields where they played soccer. The isolation of the camps was deliberate. Most were located in rural areas where the war felt distant, almost unreal. Prisoners worked alongside American farmers who were short on labor due to the draft. They picked cotton in Texas, harvested wheat in Kansas, cut timber in Michigan. They lived in a strange limbo, still prisoners, still enemies, but treated with a civility that clashed with everything they'd been taught. At night, lying in their bunks, some prisoners wrote letters home. The letters were censored, but the tone was consistent. Confusion, disbelief, a slow, uncomfortable realization that they had been lied to. Germany was losing. The cities were being bombed into rubble. Rations were failing. And here, in the heart of the enemy nation, there was ice cream. This was the world they had entered, a world where propaganda met reality and shattered quietly, one cold bottle at a time. The moment arrived differently for each man, but the reaction was always the same: disbelief. Private Hans Lammerstorff, captured in Tunisia in May 1943, later recalled his first meal at Camp Concordia in Kansas. He sat at a long wooden table with 20 other prisoners. The American guards brought out trays of food: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, white rolls with butter, and a slice of apple pie for dessert. Hans stared at the pie. He hadn't seen a dessert in 2 years. He thought it was a mistake, that it was meant for the guards. When told it was his, he didn't touch it for 10 minutes. He thought it might be taken away. It wasn't. And the next day, there was more. For soldiers raised in the Great Depression, conscripted into a war economy where everything was rationed and recycled, American abundance was alien. Coca-Cola became a symbol of this shock. The cold, sweet, fizzing drink in a glass bottle, ubiquitous in America, unthinkable in wartime Germany. Prisoners lined up for it like children. Some saved the bottles as souvenirs. Others drank it slowly, savoring every sip, trying to understand how a nation at war could produce something so frivolous, so purely for pleasure. America didn't just feed its prisoners, it exposed them to its culture, intentionally or not. At Camp Ruston in Louisiana, an ice cream truck visited once a week. Prisoners could purchase cones with their camp scrip. Grown men, soldiers who had fought in North Africa and Italy, stood in line for vanilla and chocolate like schoolboys. Some had never tasted ice cream before. It melted in the heat, sticky and sweet, and they laughed about it, embarrassed by their own delight. Baseball games were organized. The prisoners didn't understand the rules at first, but they played anyway, swinging bats and running bases while American guards cheered or heckled from the sidelines. It was absurd. It was human, and it was impossible to reconcile with the image of a ruthless, decadent enemy. Music played a role too. Jazz, swing, big band, sounds that had been banned in Germany as degenerate. Prisoners heard it drifting from guard barracks or town radios. Some hated it on principle. Others found themselves tapping their feet. The mind resists contradictions. It builds walls, creates excuses. But walls crack under sustained pressure. German prisoners had been indoctrinated for years. They believed in the Führer, in the righteousness of the war, in the superiority of the German people. They believed that America was weak, corrupt, and doomed. Then they lived in American camps, ate American food, and saw American wealth up close. Cognitive dissonance set in. Some prisoners clung to their beliefs, insisting that the abundance was a facade, that the real America, the starving, chaotic America, was hidden just out of sight. Others began to question, quietly at first, in whispered conversations. Why would a starving nation feed its enemies so well? Why would a collapsing society waste resources on ice cream for prisoners? The questions had no good answers, not if you believed the propaganda. So some stopped believing. The American government understood that mines were battlefields too. Starting in 1944, the War Department launched a re-education program aimed at denazifying German POWs before they returned home. Camps received newspapers, German-language publications printed by American authorities, reporting Allied victories and exposing Nazi atrocities. Prisoners were skeptical at first, dismissing them as propaganda, but the newspapers kept coming. And the stories were consistent. The fall of Roma, the liberation of Paris, the discovery of concentration camps, photographs, testimony, evidence. Films were shown, documentaries about the war, about democracy, about the crimes committed in Germany's name. Some prisoners refused to watch. Others watched in silence, faces unreadable. A few wept. Educational classes were offered. English lessons, American history, civics. The goal was not to make Germans love America, but to make them reject totalitarianism, to plant seeds of doubt that might grow into something better after the war. It didn't work on everyone. Hardcore Nazis remained Nazis, but for many, especially younger soldiers who had been conscripted, who had fought because they had no choice, the seeds took root. German POWs didn't just sit behind barbed wire, they worked. And that work brought them into contact with ordinary Americans in ways that no propaganda film ever could. Prisoners were leased out to farms and factories, desperate for labor. They picked crops, repaired roads, worked in canning plants and lumber mills. They were paid 80 cents a day according to Geneva Convention standards, and they worked alongside American civilians who were curious, sometimes friendly, occasionally hostile. In small towns across the South and Midwest, it wasn't uncommon to see German prisoners eating lunch in fields, shopping at local stores under guard, or attending church services on Sunday. Some farmers grew fond of their POW laborers, treating them like hired hands rather than enemies. Friendships formed. Not many, but enough. There were stories, unverified but persistent, of prisoners being invited to family dinners, of playing cards with guards, of being allowed to wander into town unsupervised because there was nowhere to run anyway. German POWs in America lived in conditions that were almost utopian compared to what captured Germans faced elsewhere. In the Soviet Union, German prisoners were sent to labor camps in Siberia, where survival was a daily struggle against cold, starvation, and brutality. Hundreds of thousands died. Those who returned home did so years, sometimes decades later. Broken men. Even in British and French camps, conditions were harsher. Food was scarce. Discipline was strict. The war had ravaged Europe, and there was little sympathy for captured Germans. America, untouched by bombing, flush with industrial capacity, could afford generosity. And that generosity became a weapon more effective than any bullet, because the prisoners went home, and they remembered. The breaking point didn't come all at once. It came in small moments, repeated over months, until the weight of evidence became undeniable. It came on a sweltering afternoon in June 1944, when a shipment of ice cream arrived at Camp McCain in Mississippi. The guards announced it casually. Dessert after lunch. Prisoners lined up, suspicious. Ice cream was a luxury, even in peacetime Germany. In wartime, it was unthinkable. One prisoner, a former schoolteacher from Hamburg named George Fisher, took his cup and stared at it. He had been told that American civilians were rioting over bread shortages, yet here was ice cream, handed out freely to enemy soldiers. He ate it slowly, methodically, trying to make sense of the contradiction. He couldn't. It came in letters, the ones that made it through censorship. Prisoners wrote home carefully, knowing that every word would be read by authorities on both sides. But between the lines, the truth leaked through. "We are treated well here. The food is adequate. I am not mistreated." Families in Germany, starving in bombed-out cities, read these letters and didn't believe them. How could they? The gap between the two realities was too vast. It came during film screenings. In late 1944, the U.S. War Department began showing footage from liberated concentration camps. Prisoners were required to attend. Many refused to believe what they saw. "British propaganda," some muttered. "Lies," others insisted. But the footage kept coming. Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, mountains of bodies, living skeletons, gas chambers. Some prisoners walked out. Others sat in stunned silence. A few broke down. One prisoner, Corporal Heinz Schultz, captured in Normandy, later described the moment his worldview collapsed. He had believed, truly believed, that Germany was fighting a defensive war, that the Allies were the aggressors, that the Führer was protecting the German people from destruction. Then he saw the films. Then he read the testimonies. Then he sat in his bunk at night, trying to reconcile what he'd been told with what he now knew. The effort exhausted him. Eventually, he stopped trying to reconcile. He just accepted that he'd been lied to. The turning point was different for every man, but the mechanism was the same. Propaganda requires isolation. It requires control of information. It requires that people never see the alternative with their own eyes. The American camps stripped all of that away. Prisoners didn't just hear about American abundance, they ate it. They didn't just read about democracy, they watched guards and prisoners joke together, watched civilians treat them like human beings rather than monsters. By 1945, as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, the psychological shift among prisoners had become widespread. Not universal. There were still fanatics, still men who refused to let go of the ideology they'd fought for, but they were increasingly in the minority. The moment of true crisis came with Germany's surrender in May 1945. News reached the camps in waves: Hitler's death, the fall of Berlin, the unconditional surrender. Some prisoners celebrated quietly, relieved that the killing was over. Others sank into despair, unable to process the magnitude of the defeat. A few attempted suicide. Guards increased patrols, watched for signs of unrest, but the expected violence never came. Instead, something stranger happened. Prisoners began to talk openly, without fear, about what came next, about returning to a Germany that no longer existed, to cities that had been erased, to families they hadn't heard from in years. And increasingly, they talked about what they had learned in America. One prisoner, captured late in the war and held at Camp Blanding in Florida, wrote in his diary, later published in the 1980s, about the day he realized he didn't want to go home. Not because he loved America, but because he no longer recognized the Germany he'd left behind. "I fought for a lie," he wrote, "and now I must return to live among the ruins of that lie." The re-education programs intensified after the surrender. Prisoners attended lectures on democracy, on the Nuremberg trials, on the reconstruction of Europe. Some resisted, others engaged, asked questions, debated. The camps became, in a strange way, classrooms, places where men who had been raised under totalitarianism encountered, often for the first time, the idea that government could be questioned, that authority was not absolute, that individuals had rights that no state could justly revoke. The ice cream and Coca-Cola hadn't just been treats, they had been proof that abundance was possible, proof that a free society could outproduce and outlast a dictatorship, proof that the ideology they'd been taught was not just wrong, but catastrophically, ruinously wrong. Not every prisoner left the camps a convert to democracy, but most left with doubts. and doubt, once planted, is difficult to uproot. Years later, historians would interview former POWs, now elderly men living in Germany. Many credited their time in American camps with saving them, not from death, but from remaining Nazis. "They defeated us with kindness," one said, "and it was far more effective than defeating us with cruelty." Repatriation began in late 1945 and continued through 1946. German prisoners were shipped back across the Atlantic in the same crowded transports that had brought them, but they returned to a country unrecognizable from the one they'd left. Germany was rubble. Cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin existed only as shells. Infrastructure had collapsed. Millions were homeless. The economy had disintegrated. Food was scarce. The black market ruled. And everywhere, the psychological weight of defeat and guilt pressed down like a physical force. Returning POWs carried with them stories that seemed impossible. They spoke of American camps where food was plentiful, where they'd been treated humanely, where they'd played sports and earned wages and eaten ice cream. To Germans who had survived the firebombing of their cities, who had watched children starve, these stories sounded like fantasies or lies. Many returnees learned to stay quiet. The gap between what they'd experienced and what their families had endured was too vast to bridge with words. Some prisoners chose not to return at all, though most were repatriated. A small number, several thousand, requested permission to stay in the United States. Some had married American women. Others had no homes left to return to. A few simply preferred the opportunities they saw in America to the ruins of Germany. The U.S. government allowed some to remain, particularly those with valuable skills, or those who had cooperated fully with re-education programs. The long-term psychological effects were profound. Studies conducted decades later found that German POWs who had been held in the United States were significantly less likely to support far-right political movements than those who had been held in Soviet or even French camps. The experience of humane treatment, of exposure to democratic ideals, appeared to have a lasting impact. One former prisoner interviewed in 1989 described returning to his village in Bavaria in 1946. His neighbors asked him what the Americans had done to him. He told them about the food, the work, the treatment. They didn't believe him. They thought I was lying to make myself look better, he said. But I wasn't. It was simply the truth. The policy of humane treatment also served America's strategic interests. As the Cold War emerged in the late 1940s, West Germany became a crucial ally. The Marshall Plan poured billions into rebuilding the country. Former enemies became partners, and quietly, the fact that America had treated German POWs decently during the war helped smooth that transition. Former prisoners became bridges. Some returned to the United States as immigrants in the 1950s and 1960s, bringing families with them. German-American communities grew. Friendships formed during wartime, between guards and prisoners, between farmers and laborers, were rekindled through letters and visits. Towns that had hosted POW camps sometimes maintained relationships with the men who had worked there, inviting them back for reunions decades later. There were ironies and contradictions. While German POWs ate ice cream in Texas, Japanese Americans were held in internment camps under far harsher conditions, their rights stripped away despite being U.S. citizens. While America treated enemy soldiers humanely, it still practiced segregation, still denied basic rights to Black Americans, some of whom served as guards over the German prisoners. The generosity extended to captured Germans highlighted, by contrast, the injustices America perpetrated against its own people. Yet the policy succeeded on its own terms. It demonstrated that democracy could afford to be humane, even toward enemies. It showed that strength didn't require cruelty, and it planted seeds that would grow over decades into a stable, democratic Germany allied with the West. By the 1970s and 1980s, as scholars began documenting the POW experience, a clear pattern emerged in interviews. Men who had spent the war in American camps spoke of it as a turning point. Not all became Democrats or pacifists, but most acknowledged that the experience had changed them, had shaken beliefs they'd once held as certainties. "We expected hell," one former prisoner said in a 1995 documentary. "We got ice cream instead." And that difference, that simple, strange difference, made me question everything I thought I knew. The camps closed, the barracks were torn down or repurposed, the land returned to farmland or was sold off, but the memory remained, carried by the men who had lived it and passed down through families and history books. There is a photograph, black and white, faded now. It shows a group of German prisoners at Camp Concordia in 1944, standing in line at a canteen. They are smiling. One holds a bottle of Coca-Cola up to the camera, as if in a toast. They look young. They look ordinary. They could be anyone. This is what history often forgets, that wars are fought by ordinary people, many of whom had no say in the ideologies that sent them to battle. The German soldiers held in American camps were not all Nazis. Many were conscripts. Men who fought because refusing meant death. They believed what they were told because they had no access to alternative information. And then, suddenly, they did. The ice cream and Coca-Cola were not just treats, they were arguments. They were proof that the ideology they'd been raised under was built on lies. Abundance, freedom, generosity. These were not weaknesses. They were strengths. And they were incompatible with totalitarianism. America's treatment of German POWs was not purely altruistic. It served strategic and propaganda purposes. It demonstrated to the world that democracy could wage war without losing its humanity. But it also, quietly and persistently, changed minds. It turned enemies into skeptics, and skeptics into men who would help rebuild Germany as a democracy after the war. Decades later, a former prisoner returned to Texas, to the site of the camp where he'd been held. The barracks were gone. The land was farmland again. He walked the fields, remembering. He had brought with him a bottle of Coca-Cola, purchased at a gas station on the drive. He opened it, took a sip, and smiled. This, he told the journalist accompanying him, was the beginning of my real education. Wars are won with weapons, but sometimes they are also won with gestures of humanity that prove more powerful than any bomb. The German prisoners who returned home carrying memories of ice cream and kindness became quiet witnesses to a different way of living. And in a century defined by ideology and violence, that quiet testimony mattered more than anyone expected. Wars are won with weapons, but sometimes they are also won with gestures of humanity that prove more powerful than any bomb. The German prisoners who returned home carrying memories of ice cream and kindness became quiet witnesses to a different way of living. And in a century defined by ideology and violence, that quiet testimony mattered more than anyone expected. The camps are gone now, the barracks dismantled, the watchtowers torn down. But somewhere in Germany, an old man still remembers the taste of his first Coca-Cola, the cold sweetness, the impossible abundance, the moment when everything he'd been taught began to unravel. He remembers standing in a Texas field, August heat pressing down, holding a glass bottle that shouldn't have existed, and he remembers thinking, for the first time in years, that maybe, just maybe, he'd been on the wrong side. That bottle changed nothing. And it changed everything.